The Blackburn B-24 Skua, not to be confused with the consolidated B-24 Liberator, which is probably more famous here in America, was a British carrier-based, low-wing, two-seater aircraft, powered by a single-radial engine, and it was developed by Blackburn Aircraft. It was the first Royal Navy carrier-borne, all-metal, monoplane aircraft, as well as the first dive bomber in the Fleet Air Arm. They had a crew of 2, a pilot and a rear gunner, a length of 35 feet 7 inches, a wingspan of 46 feet 2 inches, a height of 12 feet 6 inches, and a gross weight of 8,228 pounds. They were powered by a single Bristol Perseus 9-cylinder air-cooled radial sleeve valve piston engine, and that was capable of delivering 890 horsepower, which drove a 3-bladed variable pitch propeller. And this drove the aircraft to a maximum speed of 225 miles per hour. Which, wait, that sounds really slow. And it is. The Skua is a quirky aircraft. Blackburn in general had a really rough time developing planes during the mid-30s into the end of World War II. A lot of their aircraft were viewed as either useless or, in some cases, outright dangerous. We just talked about the Blackburn Botha, which was far more likely to kill its own crew than actually do anything about the enemy. But the Skua is an interesting case because out of all of Blackburn's creations during this period, it was probably the most misunderstood. Because it was flawed, yes, but the Royal Navy did get significant use out of them either way, and while it is known as a terrible fighter that could not at all compete with the fighters that other nations were utilizing, you probably already noticed that I mentioned that it was also a dive bomber. And that's where its strengths really come out, and it seems that the issues with the Skua are more down to a lack of knowledge, rather than them being outright terrible. The origins of the Skua go all the way back to the Air Ministry's issuing of what was known as Specification 0.27/34. They were looking for a naval dive bomber, whose primary role would be to disable or destroy enemy aircraft carriers, as well as having a secondary role as a fighter. Blackburn, of course, produced its own response to this particular specification, and their entry was selected, and that would eventually result in the Skua. It sometimes was also referred to as DB-1, and that was because this was actually Blackburn's first ever dive bomber. They'd never built one before. In April of 1935, Blackburn did receive the initial order for a pair of prototypes, and on February 9th, 1937, the first one, which was serial number K5178, performed her maiden flight. On June 22nd, she was displayed to the public at RAF Hendon in London, and performed an aerial display at RAF Hatfield Woodhouse 2 days after that. 2 months later, the Skua name was officially assigned to the type by the Air Ministry, which is in reference to skuas, which are a group of predatory seabirds, who have a habit of also dive bombing in nature, against potential predators that come too close to their nests, so it was a very appropriate name. During the end of 1937, the prototypes went through handling trials with the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, and on May 4th, 1938, the second prototype took to the skies, and she was a bit different than her earlier sister, as she was given a slightly longer nose. Both planes would participate in multiple tests, as well as gunnery trials, that would be performed up until early 1939. The prototypes would differ in their power plants, as they still used a radial engine, but theirs were Bristol Mercury 12s. Production Skuas did have the Bristol Perseus 12s, and that was because the Mercury was being prioritized for producing Bristol Blenheims, which were light bombers. Another change that was made on the production aircraft was eliminating the wingtip slots, as they weren't necessary after handling tests revealed that there were very mild stall characteristics. And due to the growing urgency for more combat aircraft in the years leading up to World War II, the initial production contract that was made in July of 1935 called for 190 Skuas to be produced, and that meant they were basically ordered straight off the drawing board, which is very British Rail of them. Thank you for that. On August 28th, 1938, the first production, Skua Mark II, serial number L2867, performed her first flight, and the second production aircraft, her immediate sister, would be dispatched to Martlesham to accelerate the last stage of the performance trials, which also included armament trials. And it's important to mention that in those days, the actual design of the Skua was considered fairly radical. It was a new concept, though very few changes were actually recommended. The only real major requests were a call to strengthen the wingtips, as well as give them a substitute tail oleo, which is a pneumatic air oil hydraulic shock absorber. And almost all the production aircraft that would be built were completed and delivered prior to the end of 1939. 26 of the planes were delivered during the month of July alone. However, when World War II began and the Skuas were sent into action, it was noticed that there was a bit of a major problem with them. As you likely recall, when I mentioned their particular characteristics, they were pretty slow. Very slow, compared to their contemporaries anyway. And this wasn't really Blackburn's fault. This was a compromise, because the Air Ministry had specifically requested a dual-purpose plane. One that could be a dive bomber and a fighter. And in the 1930s, that was a pretty tall order. Their fighter performance was greatly compromised. For one thing, they were large, since they were two-seaters, and the extra strengthening of their airframe that was required to withstand the stresses of sustained high-speed dives meant that they were really heavy for single-engined aircraft. As I said, they were a little over 8,000 pounds. The weight of a Spitfire Mark I was less than 6,000 pounds. So you can kind of see the difference here. And Skuas were meant to be carrier-based aircraft, so there were a bunch of modifications that had to be added to them to make them suitable for that. They needed an arrestor hook, folding wings, higher than average fuel capacity, watertight compartments, rescue rafts in case they had to ditch in water, and the reason they were two-seaters is to have a rear gunner. All this made the Skuas even heavier, and the Perseus engine just could not get them up to a decent speed, and their rate of climb was horrific, even when compared to other carrier-based fighters of their time, like the Mitsubishi A5M for Japan, and the American Grumman 53F, which was a biplane. Heck, the Royal Navy's own biplane, the Gloucester Sea Gladiator, could climb faster than a Skua. Granted, the Skua was very heavily armed, as they did have 4 wing-mounted Browning machine guns, which was better than any other nation's pre-war naval fighter, but given their deployment, you may notice they'd be mostly against Germany. Now, Germany never had an active aircraft carrier, but they had plenty of land-based fighters, and the Bf-109s could fly circles around Skuas. But in Blackburn's defense, they never envisioned that the Skuas would need to take on land-based fighters. That wasn't what they were really for, and they had prioritized making a good dive bomber, since the fighter element was again meant to be a secondary component. The Royal Navy and the RAF, the latter of which, at the time of the specification, actually operated aircraft carrier air wings, both only intended the Skuas to take on enemy reconnaissance aircraft as well as bombers, not enemy fighters. And in terms of its main role, being a dive bomber, it was actually really good. Genuinely so. They had numerous successes doing that in the Norwegian campaign. They sunk and damaged plenty of ships, like the Kriegsmarine's Königsberg, on April 10th, 1940. She was actually the first major warship sunk in World War II by air attack, as well as by dive bombers, so it was a big moment for the Skuas. Legendary Royal Navy test pilot, Captain Eric Brown, of course flew the Skua, because he flew everything. And while he admitted that as a fighter they were completely lackluster, when it came to diving, they were actually very excellent. In terms of that specific role, they matched up well with other nations' dive bombers, doing the role just fine, which is actually a lot more impressive when you consider that Blackburn hadn't ever made a dive bomber before. This was their first attempt at it, and it did that job extremely well. It was the dual role element that really held the Skua back, unless of course they were going after targets that the Royal Navy had envisioned for them. They actually shot down plenty of bombers, as well as flying boats over Norway. Skuas were credited with destroying 28 Luftwaffe aircraft in air-to-air combat. Lieutenant Commander William Lucy even became an ace pilot in a Skua. So it wasn't like they couldn't be a fighter, but they had to be against very specific targets, mainly not other fighters. And as Luftwaffe changed their tactics and sent a lot more fighters out with their bombers, the Skuas were a heck of a lot more vulnerable, and began to be picked apart. Because of this, they had to withdraw them from frontline service in 1941, with most being replaced with the ferry Fulmar, which had better forward armament and could fly 50 miles per hour faster than Skuas could. Their secondary roles consisted of being target tugs, which is not a glamorous job, but it's a job, and they were also used as advanced trainers for the Fleet Air Arm, since while they were lacking in performance when compared to other fighters, they weren't actually that hard to fly. They were actually fairly forgiving aircraft, stable in the air, so as trainers they were perfectly suitable, and the last Skua in service was struck off in March of 1945. To date, no intact Skuas actually survived. They were all scrapped or shot down, but there is one that was discovered in April 2007, 794 feet underwater. This aircraft wasn't actually shot down. She suffered an engine failure, and her pilot, John Casson, who was actually the leader of the 803 Squadron, had to make an emergency water landing in the fjord. Both John and his gunner did survive this, and would spend the next 5 years as POWs. When she was found, she was actually nearly intact, and an effort was made to recover her. The effort involved trying to get her to the surface as gently as reasonably possible, since she had been sitting underwater for over 50 years, but this didn't go perfectly. Her tail broke off, and her engine had detached when she crash-landed. But the fuselage, cockpit, and wings were salvaged, and that aircraft actually planned to be restored at Norway's Aviation Museum. There's another one also, serial number L2940, which was recovered in 1974 in a lake, also in Norway. This one was another emergency landing, conducted by Captain R.T. Partridge, who did so after he shot down a Heinkel HE-111 on April 27, 1940. The lake was covered in ice at the time, and the crew survived, and in fact so would members from the enemy crew from the HE-111. They would make their way to a mountain lodge and encounter each other. This incident actually serves as the basis for the 2012 film Into the White. Also, L2940 is on display at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, just so you know. So ultimately, at the end of the day, what can be said about the Skua? Well, in my opinion, I just think they're a little overhated. Yeah, they didn't do great as fighters, but it's clear that Blackburn was focused on the whole dive bombing thing, and for that role, they were actually very good at it. They did get outclassed pretty quickly, but that could be said for a lot of aircraft as well. I mean, over here in America, we had the devastated torpedo bombers, which got rolled immediately. And it wasn't necessarily due to the fact that they were bad, they just became obsolete immediately. The Skua is kind of a similar case, but the Royal Navy did make sufficient use out of them, and they served their country faithfully. And even though the surviving aircrafts are in pieces, at least we still have those pieces. As I think this aircraft deserves a bit more respect than they generally get. And with that, special thank yous to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Spencer Kitsune 131-232, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Aurora Videos, Lord Off 444, Mark Holding, Margaret Dronestall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Ro Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Cross White, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Arizona Hot Rail, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, and Dr. Racer 78. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a big well of fun, farewell.